This has been a long battle. How much certainty does this provide? Is the entire case over?
So this provides a lot of certainty for Ripple, for frankly me personally, because the SEC had sued me. The SEC has abandoned their appeal. And so they filed suit in December of 2020. We won on the key parts of the case in the summer of 23. Judge Torres made a ruling that XRP in and of itself was not a security. That's almost a verbatim quote. The SEC filed an appeal about 8 months ago. And what they've now agreed is that they're going to drop that appeal. We still have a cross appeal pending. And so we go from being defendant really to plaintiff. So we now are in the driver's seat to determine how we want to proceed.
Are you dropping it?
We're going to see. It feels a lot better to be on the offense than the defense. You know, 4 years, we spent over $150 million defending that case, not just for Ripple, but for the whole industry. I think it was really important. That what we're seeing now happen in Washington is smart legislation will come forward. You're seeing that happen with stable coins in real time. And I think you'll have a market structure bill, is what it's described as, to provide clarity and rules for the SEC and CFTC.
We will look at the bigger picture.
Right.
We're going to have you.
Would I have walked away from that before they appealed, before President Trump put Paul Atkins and Scott Bessent and David Sachs as critical, key, very smart leaders in this industry to bring this industry back on shore? I would have walked away. Now you look at that and you're like, this case in this SEC never would have been brought. And so where we find ourselves is great. There's a clear legal victory to say XRP is not a security. That was good for the industry. But there's pieces of it that we think could be kind of cleaned up. And the question is, do we want to fight that fight, or can we come to an agreement with the SEC to drop everything?
The whole idea that this wouldn't have been brought under this SEC, have you had that specific discussion with Paul Atkins and with David Sachs?
Well, Paul Atkins hasn't yet been confirmed. He's a very knowledgeable guy about this industry and has been for a long time. But I've had conversations. I won't comment on specifics with certainly, I think David Sachs would agree that this is a case that didn't make a lot of sense in the beginning. And again, there was no investor harm. This was about Gary Gensler waging a war against this industry. You know,
it's interesting. I want to also point out that the affiliated token, of course, XRP, has been up roughly 14%, now about 13% in the last 24 hours. You know, one thing a lot of people had looked at, we're thinking a lot about how the administration is handling crypto assets.
XRP. Look, at the end of the day, I think the stark contrast is in the Biden administration, we couldn't get a meeting with people at the White House. Now we're welcomed into the White House, and that's just a massive change. I think we want this industry to thrive in the United States. We don't want to push it offshore where you have fewer regulations.
So is listing possible now for you for Ripple?
Well, it's certainly something that is possible. The United States SEC under Gensler was so hostile to this industry. I mean, ironically, they approved the S1 from Coinbase and then sued them for doing the things they said they were doing. So this SEC, fortunately, is going to be, I think, very constructive and positive for this industry. So I think that's available, and I think the company's at a stage where we could consider that. That being said, it isn't a huge priority. I think most companies are going public. Raising capital is something that is high on their radar. We have been in a very fortunate position to be able to grow the business organically. We're also, frankly, more proactive in looking at acquisitions. This is an industry that finally is going to be able to thrive in the United States, the largest economy in the world. And I think the industry is still underestimating the shift from the headwinds to the tailwinds. That's going to make a bigger difference than people think. And finally, the U.S. market is really unlocked.
So it sounds like what you're saying, acquisitions are almost more of a priority now than an IPO.
Saying positive things. I think the two areas you'll see the most activity in the short term, one is around custody. These are banks that want to be able to custody, particularly when you see real world assets being tokenized. You need to be able to safely manage and custody that for customers and potentially for the bank. And the second is around payments. The global payments infrastructure still remains very dated. Wires are slow. I just had a wire that was sending over euros disappear for 5 days. That's surprising in a world of the internet.
So one part of that payments infrastructure that I'm watching really closely is, of course, stablecoins.
Sure.
There is starting to be more clarity in Washington, and you're seeing people starting to use stablecoins in really interesting ways. I think about Robinhood, for example, using stablecoin in terms of facilitating 24-hour trading. What's next? I mean, if you think about the next forefront of stablecoins now that the U.S. is getting toward clarity, what's possible?
Well, again, I think we're underestimating how big that might get. Today that market's about $230 billion. So I think some smart people think that may go up 10x in the next 5 years. I think that's probably right. I mean, the two leading players in Tether as well as USDC are both, I think, poised to do well in that market. Ripple launched our own stablecoin at the end of last year. That's already ahead of our own internal forecasts in terms of where we are at this point in the year. Still, we're small, but the goal is by the end of the year for RLUSD, Ripple stablecoin, to be one of the top 5 in the market by the end of the year. And I think the whole market's going to grow